All right, good morning everyone. Welcome to our broadcast today. The topic today will be supply chain verification strategies for BRC certified sites. My name is Sarah Curran. I'm with Eurofins. And before we get started here today, I'll just go over a few housekeeping items and then introduce our speakers. So the first thing to note is that this webinar will be recorded, and we will distribute a recording of this webinar to everyone who is registered a few days following this live broadcast. It will also be available on the Eurofins Resource Center within the next 72 hours. All questions will be answered at the end of the presentation. So please submit your questions throughout, and if we do not have time to address your question, someone will follow up with you to answer your question after the live broadcast is over. To submit your questions, please type them into the questions panel in the sidebar of your GoToWebinar dashboard. And those will be logged, like I said, for the question and answer portion at the end of the presentation. Our presenters today will be Sebnem Karasu, the Global Account Director for BRC Global Standards, John Kikoli, America's Director of BRC Global Standards, and Gary Smith, Food Safety Systems Director with Eurofins Scientific Food Safety Systems. I will hand it off now to Sebnem to introduce the BRC Global Standard.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining our webinar today. And I would like to give you a brief introduction to BRC Global Standards and hand the microphone to Gary and John to present you with information regarding supply chain verification strategies, which we hope will be useful to you on the way to FSMA. BRC Global Standards has been established in 1996 in the UK by British retailers. However, over the years became a global standard and a global company. We are the first food safety standard to be recognized by GFSI exactly 17 years ago. And many other standards were then published besides food safety, including packaging, consumer products, storage and distribution, agents and brokers, and retail. And we have recently been acquired by the LGC Group. Next slide, please. We have over 25,000 sites certified globally, and we are the first scheme to implement the auditor category exams and the only scheme to offer portability, reducing the audit burden with additional modules. The first GFSI standard to define food fraud and the one to introduce the unannounced audits. And we are the largest GFSI manufacturing scheme in the world. Next slide, please. As I said, we have over 25,000 sites certified globally, and we have 3 offices, London, Chicago, and New Delhi. Our standard is translated into 16 languages, and we have 65 publications which are available to you through our directory. And I like this number here, 144,000 non-compliances per year, which means we are reducing food safety risks in the chain 144,000 times. And of course, this number is growing. Next slide, please. We talked about the 6 standards. Besides these, we also provide training through our academy and organize events throughout the year. We have one coming up in 2 weeks in Orlando. Next slide, please. Food Safety Americas, which will host reputable speakers throughout the industry, covering the main topic of building resilience in a changing world. Please try to attend and contact us after the webinar if you have any questions. With this, I would like to present you Gary Smith to start his presentation. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Sebnem. And let me just say that Eurofins, we're very excited and proud to be partnering with Eurofins as our Eurofins partnering with the BRC in the presentation of this webinar, and we've got a lot of exciting activities coming up in the future that I'll be talking to you about at the end of the presentation. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the supplier verification activities. And as we are trying to advance the slide, yeah, Sarah, why don't you just go ahead and grab it. I pushed on it, but it wasn't working. Thank you. Okay, so my job is to kind of talk to you a little bit about supplier verifications. And Sarah, if we can go to the next one. I want to make the case for having a strong verification activity. So I'm going to go over some case studies here first, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about the regulatory environment that we find ourselves in today on supplier verification, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the best practices of supplier verification activity. So first, one presentation here or case study, and probably all of us, or some of us who've been around the industry for a while, remember the ice cream contamination with salmonella, 1994. And obviously the theme of some of the information that we're going to provide you here over the next couple of case studies is bringing product in that is contaminated from your supply chain and your process either not built for or not being able to control those food safety hazards once they're brought in. In this case, with the salmonella in the raw milk mix, it was actually what it was pasteurized ice cream mix that had been hauled in tankers that had been used for hauling liquid raw eggs. So it wasn't even really a supply chain issue from the supplier. It was more of the same transportation issue. And this is what triggered the advent of wash ticket requirements for any products hauling any types of liquids or anything into the industry. And we saw that in this case it was quite extraordinary that salmonella was in a very low concentration, very low dosage within the product, and still caused over 240,000 illnesses. So this was a case of really a transportation supply chain issue. And again, this was a classic case study which certainly changed the way that we haul product, specifically liquid product. Next slide, please, Sarah. The next example that we have, I'm sure everyone is very familiar with. This was one of the largest outbreaks in food industry history. 2008, the Peanut Corporation of America sold peanut butter contaminated with salmonella, and that affected the industry for months as traceability programs and brokers and agents and whatnot, product coming from areas that we didn't really have well identified, well linked. And what we saw here in the case, obviously, was salmonella was found in the product. Resampling done until the product was negative, and then it was sent out. So this was the classic case for the need for supplier verification. What are your suppliers doing? How much do you trust those letters of guarantee or even those certificate of analyses that you may be receiving from your supplier? And certainly you could say that this case study was the advent for some of the examples we're going to talk about next of the need for supplier preventive controls as we find in the Food Safety Modernization Act. This was also, should be noted, this was the first case where some of those manufacturers actually went to jail, and we now see the FDA and the Department of Justice taking a much more active role in prosecution of food safety issues, where prior to this event in 2008 that had never happened before. So it was certainly industry changing as well. Sarah, next slide, please. So we can talk about the regulatory framework that we find ourselves in today on supplier verification. And again, we can find the origins of certainly supplier preventive control back to the PCA outbreak. But if you look at FSMA today, and again, we understand not everyone is under the FDA's jurisdiction, so Food Safety Modernization Act is only affecting those folks who are under the FDA's jurisdiction and have FDA registration. But there are two main parts to the Supplier Verification Preventive Control FSMA rule. The first one is the Foreign Supplier Verification Program. And as we know, that is where international suppliers who are subject to the Preventive Controls rule must be verified by their importers of record that they meet the rule. The importer of record, who is the manufacturer here in the United States, requires that must have verification that those suppliers who they're bringing product in from overseas areas meet the rule. And again, you can use your broker or you can use your agent, but it's the importer of record, the manufacturer, that individual or company who's responsible for meeting the rule, who must ensure that those foreign suppliers meet the rule. And the compliance date starts, some of the initial compliance dates are May 30th of this year. So we're basically a little more than 2 months away from the advent of foreign supplier verification beginning. The other part of the regulatory framework of FSMA that deals with supplier verification activities is, of course, the Preventive Control Rule, specifically around supplier preventive control. And this is required when a supplier is controlling a food safety hazard for the facility. So again, if we look back to the PCA activity, if that supplier is making peanut butter, roasting peanuts, and supposedly providing a kill step or a control step for that hazard, in this case it was salmonella, and then that product is not going to go through a further process to control that food safety hazard within the manufacturer's facility or your facility, then you are required to put in place a supplier preventive control, which includes verification activities that we're going to talk about next, that ensures that those controls are effective in dealing with that food safety hazard. Some of those verification activities can include an audit, and when you have a food safety hazard like salmonella, it's required to be an audit of the supplier to ensure that that food safety control is effectively controlled by your supplier. So we've got two elements of the FSMA rule that deal with supplier activity, and for the first time, regulatory effects is not just dealing with what is under your control. So this is the first time from a regulatory standpoint here in the United States that basically suppliers are being asked to verify the performance of their supplier through a regulatory mandate. And again, this is very new. And again, I think we can look to PCA as the reason. And but it's not just PCA. I mean, if you looked at recalls in general, I'm sure, from the BRC or some of the other standards, if you look at why they have recalls of their certified suppliers, incoming product contamination is a huge issue and a huge area for concern. And many of the, 25, 30, 35% of recalls from certified sites are from, bringing in product that is contaminated from suppliers. So supplier preventive control definitely is a need that we, I think, have identified. And now let's talk a little bit about some of the concerns, steps to take that. So Sarah, next slide, please. So as a QA manager, you may be thinking, well, what do I have to deal with now? What's next? And how do I affect that? What happens if my, QA managers and issues that they may be having and steps that they're trying to take, they talk about what's next. What happens if my vendor produces unsafe product? What do I do in the event of a recall? How do I keep bad product from the marketplace? Those folks who were bringing in peanut butter from PCA, they didn't know, and their issue is, what can they do to ensure that that producer is producing safe product, that supplier? How do they know? Now with FSMA, how do I comply with the FDA requirements? How do I ensure that a supplier in Chile or China or Italy is producing product that meets my expectations? And specifically, what do I do with my customer complaints, and what are they telling me, and how do I use those? And we're going to talk a little bit more about that in just a minute. Next slide, please. So when we look at supplier verification and approved supplier programs, we're kind of at a crux in the industry, and it's programs like the BRC, which are kind of pushing suppliers to move beyond, I guess, the old school or old style standards or activities around supplier verification. Previously it was a letter of guarantee, or it was simply a handshake. We've been doing business for 20 years, and we know each other, we're friends, and I know my supplier is a good partner, and I know they're going to take care of me. I know they're going to do the right thing. And maybe I even do have specifications, or maybe I've sent out a questionnaire and I said, tell me about your food safety program, tell me about your pest control program, tell me about your quality program. Those are kind of the way that we've been doing business for the last 30 years here in the food industry. And with the initiation and implementation of programs like the BRC, and obviously now with FSMA requirements, we have to move past the old school, old style methods of supplier verification, and we have to move on to what's more, I guess, mainstream or advanced activities around supplier verification. And those include things like on-site audits, such as the BRC, product testing programs. Certificate of analysis are good, but they're only as good as the analysis and the sampling plan and the methodology that goes behind them. How are we sampling our product? Do we have a 500,000 pound load and we're really pulling a 25-gram sample, and is that really going to give us a good representation of the effects or the attributes that we're looking for? So we're having to discuss these types of more enhanced supplier verification activities, and again, with FSMA coming down the pipe, we're required to engage these activities. But again, for those facilities who have BRC certification, these are activities that they have been asked to put in place with the advent of their certification. Next slide, please, Sarah. So as a QA manager in the industry, you know that we have a lot of different tools and a lot of different concerns. We've got co-manufacturers, we've got suppliers, we've got private label suppliers. Maybe we're doing private label for a customer. We've got customer specifications, we've got our own specifications, we've got specifications that customers give to us. We have suppliers that we're doing audits of. We're being audited by our customers. We're now being asked from a verification validation regulatory requirement with FSMA, with the BRC. Those are advents that are required. But again, with the FSMA requirement, we're now being asked for verification and validation of our supplier performance, and to show that, which we've never had to do before. The safe transportation rule part of FSMA, we have to basically have controls in place for not just us receiving the load, but how is the load being loaded at the other end. So again, where accountability has been pushed from what's in our control to now what's in our control within our supply chain. Obviously, traceability is huge, but again, our traceability is only as good as those folks who send us the product with their lot numbers on it. So we have to, again, be accountable for folks downstream from us. Of course, the nutritional labeling, and the other foreign supplier verification activities. Next slide, please, sir. So what does it all mean? What are the steps to take if we're getting ready to start our journey of FSMA compliance, and we're looking for become BRC certified? What are the steps that we should take in supplier verification? Obviously, who are our suppliers? And it sounds, for some of us, it sounds like a simple question, but for folks who have been in industry, who have been in manufacturing facilities, who get products from brokers, who get products from agents, you might not know the locations of those products, and they may change on a routine basis. Specifically, if you're heavy into commodities, grains and corn and beans and whatnot, you may not know what those locations are from day in and day out, week in and week out. But we have to. No more can we just say we're going to trust our broker. Again, we're now required to know who are our suppliers. So we're talking co-manufacturers, we're talking private label, we're talking all those suppliers. Ideally we want to have an idea of which of our ingredients that are coming in from our suppliers, what should we be concerned about, what should we be worried about from a food safety standpoint and from a quality standpoint for that matter. But a simple method to say, what's our high risk ingredients, and that high risk may be from a food safety standpoint, or the high risk may be from well, this ingredient is really important to our product, and if it's not right, our product's not going to be right. Other ingredients may not be quite as important, so you can have them have lower risk categories. But every manufacturer can determine what those risk levels are and how to assign them, but they definitely should have some means by which they say, okay, we get 300 ingredients, we get 600 ingredients, we get 500 ingredients. Which ones do we need to be worried about? Which ones do we need to be a little worried about? And which ones are kind of low on the radar? Then we talk about defining the program and the parameters. What's our supplier approval program? What's our supplier verification program? How do we monitor supplier performance on an ongoing basis? What do we want to do? So let's first decide what we want our program to be. And then, we want to communicate it to our suppliers. Let them know what we're doing. Send them out letters. Send them out, communications. Here's what we're trying to do. Here's why we're trying to do it. As our partner, help us succeed, which is going to help you down the road as well. In that, communication with the suppliers, we have to understand what are our targets for our ingredients. What are they supposed to be? How are they supposed to be performing? What are our raw material specifications? Whether those suppliers provide you with the raw material specifications, or you're partnering with them, or you're just writing them and sending them to them, we have to know what our targets are. If we're going to monitor anything, we have to know first what the target is. Then we start doing the product evaluations and testing. And of course, in some cases, we're going to have to institute audits. Certainly of private label suppliers, co-manufacturers, those high-risk products, those definitely would be the first priority of on-site audits. And those on-site audits could come from internal resources, or they could come from external resources, certification bodies, like Eurofins or others that are out there. Next, please. So specifically on some of the supplier verification activities, certainly specification review and contract parameters, those should be done on a routine basis. And, if those suppliers are supplying you with the specifications, make sure that they do fit your needs. Make sure they do have specifics. Make sure they do have targets. Make sure specifications should always have a sampling plan. They should have a defined method. If we're relying on a certificate of analysis from that supplier, is that every batch? Is that, what's the sampling plan for that? But how is that certificate of analysis developed? Who's the laboratory that's doing the testing? What's the sampling plan? What's the method being utilized? Too often I see suppliers so dependent on a certificate of analysis, that piece of paper that says that product is okay, but when I dig in and say, well, what are we analyzing, and how is it sampled, and what's the method, suppliers really don't know. And they're just relying on that supplier to do the right thing, rather than taking some initiative to be accountable for what is that piece of paper that you're sending me and what is it telling me. Label review compliance. So, how often are we looking at the label of the product that our suppliers send us? Specifically, if it's things, like claims or allergens, obviously, or, nutritional analysis. These are all, regulatory significant labels. And if we're using those labels that then we use to make up our labels, or our specifications to make up our labels, or claims to make up our labels, how do we know from our suppliers that those claims or nutritional analysis are accurate? Of course, testing verification, we talked about that. Again, certificate of analysis is only as good as the method and the sampling plan behind it. Make sure that you're in control of your supplier's testing of product on your behalf. How are they testing it? Who are they testing it with? How are they sampling it? Make sure that you have an active role in defining that with them. Of course, we need to understand, if you've got international suppliers, you need to understand what is the rule. You need to understand what are some of those verification activities that you should be doing and can be doing to ensure that you comply with the rule. Obviously, requiring foreign suppliers to have a GFSI recognized certification, starting with BRC, is a huge, great first step to getting compliance with the foreign supplier verification program. but having some training on what that rule is and what those verification programs is an important piece. And if you look at your customer complaints, what is the top area where you're getting complaints? It's interesting when I talk to manufacturers and I go out and visit food manufacturers. Oftentimes I'll ask about their complaint program and they say they only have complaints for food safety issues. They don't have a complaint if it's a quality issue. They don't count it or they don't record it as a complaint, which I think certainly is a missed opportunity for us because, if you look at top complaints from folks who are recording the quality checks, it's, foreign material, its weight, its count, its color, its taste, its texture, its packaging. It's those quality performance attributes of the product that, while we want food safety to be non-competitive, it's the quality that sets, one customer against another, one supplier against another. So, having some physical checks that you're doing of the product to make sure that it is meeting your performance requirements is a great verification tool as well. And then the last, of course, is third-party certification. An on-site audit of your supplier, certainly to a standard to the level of the BRC, is a great step to take for verification of their performance. It's not the end-all be-all, and it should include other activities as described here on the slide, but it certainly is a huge commitment to food safety and a huge step towards getting your arms around your supplier's performance if you've got that that BRC certificate that's coming in or that BRC report that's coming in from those suppliers. That's a great activity and progress towards your supplier verification program. Next, please. And then, as I said earlier, I just wanted to talk a little bit about, Eurofins and BRC, and again, we are very excited to be, partnering with them on some great activities. Certainly, this webinar is one of them. We are a premium sponsor at the conference that Sebnam mentioned in 2 weeks in Orlando. We are a training provider, and we've got the Understanding the BRC training course coming up in April 10th and 11th in Dallas. And then we are putting together, working with BRC on a focus day for those folks in the upper Midwest who maybe want to come and check out the BRC and learn a little bit more about it, how to find a certification body. Of course, in Eurofins is a 5-star CB, and we're very proud of that. But we're going to be having a unique BRC focus day partnering with the BRC up in Milwaukee on May 12th. So we certainly invite everyone to come and learn a little bit more about this BRC if you're not in the program already. And that'd be a great day and a great way to start your journey towards BRC certification. So with that, Sarah, I'll hand it back over to you.
All right, and at this time, I'm going to interject with a quick poll question for our attendees. So everyone will have 15 to 30 seconds. I'll let you guys submit responses, and then I will close the poll and display the answers. All right, just a few more seconds. Okay, thank you for participating. So in response to the question, do you have GFSI recognized certification? 82% responded yes, 18% responded no. And at this time, I will hand the presentation over to John Kukoli.
And thank you very much, as I hopefully be able to pull control from this. And Gary, well, great job. Thank you very much to Eurofins for inviting us to participate with this, and we're looking forward to that information day up in Milwaukee as well, especially once the snow goes. We should be able to have a lot more fun taking care of that. So the plan here is I'm going to touch on how BRC interacts with what Gary said. Now, Gary did a great job of outlining the expectations and the reasons we need to have supplier control. And I think specifically when you think of, managing food safety and quality within your organization, it's so much more effective to have those barriers to poor quality, poor food safety aspects pushed out as far as possible. So if it's something that we have, if we have the confidence that our supplier is going to produce and ship products to the specifications we need, meeting those quality and food safety expectations, we can focus on other things. We don't have to worry as much about what's coming in the door. So we can save some money on our testing program. We don't have to be as robust on there because we know that it's being effectively managed further out. Wherever you can push that layer of control away from your front door, push it more onto the doorsteps of your supply chain, the better your systems are going to be, the more focus you're going to be able to have on what goes on within your organization. Now, those of you, 82% said you have a GFSI benchmark certification. That's fabulous. Remember, Gary did talk about the Food Safety Modernization Act. It's important that we have supplier approval mechanisms, but it's also important that we have the confidence our suppliers have those things and have everything in place to meet the expectations of FSMA, whichever ones apply to them. Because as an organization, we need to make sure not only we're ready for the regulations, but our supply chain is, so that they can continue to partner with us. So within BRC, we talk about supply chain and managing that supply chain in two different areas. It obviously starts in your HACCP plan. Now, regardless of whether it's called a preventative control plan, a food safety plan, if we want to revert back to HARP-C or HACCP, it's the same thing. There are really three things we look at within the HACCP program, and that's, product description, the listing of the hazards, and mitigation strategies. So this is where it starts. You have to get this part correct, and then supplier verification becomes a little more rote or a little easier to follow on. Now those 2.3.1, 271, those are BRC numbers that work within the standard. So there's just some reference points there. Ingredient origin, that was the first part, 2.3.1. Why is that important? Well, we know this. If we're buying dried milk powder from a domestic source in the US versus a dried milk powder or protein-based powder from certain parts of Asia, the risks are different. So we have to understand not only what are we purchasing, what are the ingredients, what are the risks with it, but what are the additional risks depending on perhaps where we would source them within BRC, within our food, our assessment of risks against our food, against our ingredients. We also have to look at the potential for intentional adulteration. Now, depending where you're coming from in BRC, we tend to separate food defense and food fraud into two things. I think what we see in the Food Safety Modernization Act is they tend to put it all under intentional adulteration. Food defense is on the side, but it blurs just, food fraud tends to be more specifically economic. Food defense tends to be specifically harm-related. Intentional adulteration really covers both of them. So we want to make sure that that risk is understood, the potential depending where it's coming from. And when we look at that geographical origin of the ingredients as well, we have to consider getting it to our facility. Where is it going to transit through? How is it going to be transported? What systems are going to be in place? And what oversight is there while it's in that logistics operation? We could have great faith in our manufacturing plant somewhere in the world. We could have great faith in ourselves, but boy, we lose control of that product for an awful long time in between the two. And we need to make sure that that portion of it is managed as well. This is where we go back to now whole chain monitoring, understanding all the steps that happen within the supply chain and really identifying, okay, where do I need to make sure that those controls are in place? Where do I need to verify that they're working properly? When we talk about listing of the hazards, how do you do it within your, we're still within our HACCP plan. That second one is actually one of the most important parts to start with. List every hazard. Again, let's go back to we're importing ready-to-eat shrimp. List all of the hazards, or let's say we're importing frozen shrimp, non-ready-to-eat. Make sure you list all of the hazards. Don't focus yourself on only those hazards you control within your doors. Otherwise, you may miss some aspect of supply chain risk mitigation because you haven't properly identified it. So when you're thinking about supply chain, don't think about what do I have to do to control the hazards. Think, what are the key parts, not every single piece, but the key parts, as Gary mentioned, that need to be managed before me, that I need to verify are happening, or I need to see that there are systems in place that are happening properly. When we look at this, you don't have to go ingredient by ingredient. You can group them however makes sense. If you want to do all of your dry dairy blends in one group, if you want to do all your acidified liquids in another group, salt and salt-like products, you want to group them as much as possible. If you've got 1,000 raw materials, but you can group them into 50 different categories, let's work on the categories, because chances are the mitigation strategies are going to be fairly similar throughout those categories. And again, remember, don't worry about where that all hazards controlled or not, and regardless of where it's introduced, make sure you work from that perspective. So if it's something that could potentially happen in transit, in my supplier, or in my supplier's supplier, if it's a key food safety or food quality risk, let's call it a specification risk, we want to make sure there's an appropriate mitigation strategy, and we have confidence that it's working and in place. So when we look, now we're in our HACCP plan part where we talk about how do we control those hazards. We've identified them. We've made sure we've got them all. How do we control them? That list, as Gary mentioned, that list is hierarchical correct, based on how it's layered there. Your best bet is supplier approval. You want to have confidence on an ongoing basis that when that stuff arrives, if I got it from an approved supplier, I know that supplier is going to deliver what I want. That's going to be the best situation. Less comfortable, less effective is shipment approval. So we've done something either at my suppliers or at an intermediate where I can approve that shipment. Great. I now know that that's something that I can trust this one, not sure about the next one. So I don't really have full confidence in my supplier, but I've been able to approve this shipment before it leaves my supplier or in transit. Least effective on its own, testing and monitoring. And let's face it, from a food safety, from a preventative control standpoint, you can't receive and approve anymore once you become once your timelines come up under the regulations. It really does say that everything must be approved prior to receipt. So that one is going to be more of a challenge as far as a pure approval strategy, receiving something and then trying to test out what we're worried about. Testing and monitoring does have a very useful place in supplier approval mechanisms, ongoing monitoring, verification, and even some of the validation. You want to see some testing take place. But it has to be a support. Really, your key is about that approval of the supplier as a whole. So that's what we saw in our HACCP plan. Supplier oversight. Within the BRC standard, the food standard 351, 352 talks about supplier approval and verification or ongoing monitoring of that approval. You've got the two steps. Yes, I've vetted them. Here's someone new. I'm good to go with them to purchase from them, but boy, I need to monitor on an ongoing basis because that once and done is not going to be effective. So when it comes to supplier approval, as I said, you want to, and as Gary mentioned, you want to manage the risk at the supplier level. You don't want to bring risks in your door and then try to figure out how to manage them. You want to make sure they're taken care of. How do you do it? Questionnaires were the go-to. If we go back 10, 15 years now, I'm thinking, when we were using questionnaires in a manufacturing facility I worked at, they can be okay as far as gathering some information in further refining the knowledge of the risk. How is it going to be shipped? How is it managed? How do they do supply chain management? So you can at least start getting some information. If you do approve supplier verification through something like GFSI benchmarked audits, have that as your first question. Don't make somebody fill out a 30-page questionnaire and then the last question say, oh, and are you certified to one of the GFSI standards? If BRC, fine, we don't need any more information. Have that as the first question, or whatever mechanism you have. So have that questionnaire flexible enough if you're going to utilize it, and only use it for its value. Understand the limitations under the Food Safety Modernization Act, understand the limitations as far as a valid mechanism to understand and control suppliers. It's not the best. So we really need to be working away from there. Gary mentioned brokers. Brokers, hugely important to the industry, very valid role they play. BRC expects you to see right through them. You certainly have to understand them, but I need to know that, they don't do anything other, they're economic, transactional, and efficiency experts. They're not food safety experts necessarily. So we need to make sure that we don't, approve a broker as a supplier. The only way that could be possible is the broker has a supplier approval mechanism that's as effective or more so than ours. So if I'm a facility, I'm certified to BRC, And my broker, well, BRC has a broker standard, and it's all supplier approval mechanisms equal to the food standard. So if my broker is approved for the products I'm purchasing, then I know they've got an equivalent system. I don't need to have as much detail. If they're not approved to a supplier, if they're not working to a supplier approval mechanism that's equivalent to mine, I need to bypass them from a supplier approval. I need to make sure it's all done. Simply resorting to saying, I got it from a broker, therefore I don't have any control, that doesn't work anymore. So that's out the window. How you manage your audits. Gary mentioned there are lots of different audits. There are, GFSI benchmarks, there are second party, there are first party audits where you're going to do your own audits. Again, I'm going to go back to the Food Safety Modernization Act and the expectation within the BRC. They're fairly similar. The auditor has to be competent, demonstrably competent, qualified to do the audit, and it needs to be against a known audit standard. So it needs to cover certain things like traceability, like supplier approval, like food safety plan. So simply I went to audit my supply chain, and again, 20 years ago, I was doing this. I was auditing supply chain. You show up with a blank piece of paper and you do an audit, you find some nonconformities. No longer effective, no longer acceptable. Auditors that are doing this need to have the skill set. They need to have the knowledge set, and they need to be consistent in what they are auditing against, so that audit protocol that they're auditing against. I wanted to mention exceptions. BRC does have the place in it for supplier approval if you need an emergency. It doesn't exist anymore under the Food Safety Modernization Act. Really, that needs to be approved prior to receipt. And we really want to be careful on those exceptional basis in saying too much stuff we will squeak around our effective supplier approval program. We want to make sure that's moving forward. Oops, and now I've skipped through a couple. There we go. Okay. Apologies. Great. We have a supplier approval program. This is what it takes to verify my suppliers. Understand how we receive that information. So if I've got a supplier and they're emailing or faxing or mailing me a printout of a certificate, we have to recognize the fact that there is very little actual legitimacy to that whatsoever. Anybody could print up one of those, and when we look at a potential fraud risk, we've got no security on that. So where do we get our data from? All of the GFSI standards have secure databases that you can get it. I mean, BRC's got its directory. If someone's telling you the BRC certified, anybody pop on that directory, you can find them verified. Great, I know it's actually correct. And the other standards have that as well. BRC, the directory also has an ongoing verification. Now, the one thing is, if we've seen this in the past, somebody gets an audit to one of the standards, they get a certificate, they give it off to their suppliers, and 2 weeks later something happens and that certificate is revoked. They generally don't go to all of their customers and say, hey, by the way, that certificate I sent you is no longer valid, can you throw it out? BRC directory, a number of the other GFSI programs have this reporting function that if a certificate is removed, you get notified. So that's a question to ask of your scheme owner, the ones you're working with, as far as acceptable supply chain options. You want to make sure that, receipt monitoring, when that product shows up, did it come from the factory that's we approved? Is it the right brand? Is it the right factory? Is it the right location? Does it match the scope of what that organization was approved to provide for us? So some level of monitoring on receipt. Gary mentioned a number of those, let's call them somewhat older or less effective mechanisms: certificates of analysis, certificate of conformance, letter of guarantee. They're worth the paper that they're written on in general. They have their roles. Again, if you go back to, we want supplier approval, I want to work with a verified supplier that I trust. The certificate of analysis, certificate of conformance, that kind of stuff, or certificate of analysis can be a data point, but would I use a certificate of analysis as a supplier approval from a supplier I didn't necessarily trust? I think you can add those pieces together and understand where we're going on that. I want to touch very briefly on FSMA. I've got a few minutes left before we get some questions. And when we talk about it, it's really the 2 points: the import controls and the mandatory preventative controls. Very similar. Foreign supplier verification, essentially, as Gary mentioned, is preventative controls are in place, plus some additional oversight. What we really want to focus on, when we look at preventative controls that tie into the topic today, it's about the supply chain program. really what's in place, HACCP or preventative controls, how do we identify what the risks are of the supply chain program, how do we ensure that our supply chain is ready. And as was mentioned, you know, BRC covers those two aspects extremely well. When you look at the difference between what the preventative controls or foreign supply verification program is looking for versus what's required in the BRC certification, it's a few little prescriptive elements, and I'm going to show you how to cover those off on your supply chain very, very simply. If you are the importer of record, or if you are using any non-domestic ingredient, whether you're the importer of record or someone else is, let's take the steps to make sure our supply chain is going to be functional through May, as Gary mentioned, and those additional foreign supplier deadlines. So this is happening very, very soon. We have to make sure that we understand what our supply chain is, what parts of our supply chain are domestic, which are foreign. Let's step up on the foreign stuff and ask the question right now, are you currently meeting the requirements under the Foreign Supplier Verification Program? Somebody in the U.S. has to be doing that at this point, or that supplier is going to potentially disappear. So we have to make sure that we ask that question of our supply chain. You know, go back to Eurofins. They are experts at supply chain management. If it seems like a big task, geez, I've got 200 potential foreign suppliers, I don't know how I'm going to manage that. Give Gary a call. These guys, Eurofins, can really do a nice job in helping you manage that. Here are some specifics. Don't write this down. It's available. I'm going to show you where to get this. But essentially, here are the relevant parts of FSMA. The site, you're responsible to ensure your suppliers comply to FSMA. That's where it states it, 21 CFR 1.502. It's the responsibility of the qualified individual at the site, so make sure you've got that. If you haven't got a qualified individual, again, talk to Eurofins, get that training in place. 1504 talks about the requirements for the risk analysis. 1506 basically says you can't do it. I don't know if you can read it another way, but I'm thinking that's pretty much how it's going to be analyzed. And then serious hazards, as Gary mentioned, identifying that further down the supply chain, those serious hazards that could potentially need to be controlled even prior to. So I said there's a few items on that BRC helps you with in the differences. We've prepared 2 modules. We're going to be doing more. One, that green one, is really about preventative controls. And now this is the same essentially whether it's a foreign supplier or domestic supplier. This is what they have to meet. So if they're BRC certified, we know we got close but not perfect. There's 23 little prescriptive elements in there that if they've got that, we'll be able to verify that they meet the requirements under preventative controls. You can use that if you're BRC certified. Anyone can use it, guidance, or you can call Gary and Eurofins and have it added to your audit. The brown one was really developed for agents and brokers, but it looks at supply chain and FSMA. What do I need to do to ensure my supply chain is ready for FSMA? This is all the stuff depending on where it's coming from and what I've got. Great little documents, free to download off brcbookshop.com. If you have any trouble, just give one of us a shout, and we'll make sure we get that for you. So that's what I have. I'm now going to hand it back to Gary, who's going to take over for Q&A time.
Okay.
Okay. Yeah, I think Sarah's going to take some. Hopefully, we've had some questions come in, and I think we're going to take a few minutes and go through those. So, Sarah, can you? Thanks, John. That was excellent. A great presentation.
All right. We do have a few questions here that have been submitted, and all of our attendees, you do still have time to submit questions. So for our first question, I think Gary might be able to address this one. They've asked, if I have supplier approval for the manufacturer of my ingredient, but I get it from a distributor, what kind of paperwork, if any, do I need from the distributor?
Good question. Really, as far as the transportation part of it goes, the key is knowing who your supplier is. So if you do know who the supplier is and know the location specifically that it's coming from, it's not enough to know it comes from Tyson. It has to be what specific plant directly. But if the supplier, a Cisco, U.S. Food Service, PFG, or whomever is sending you the product, or in as a service for making it easier for you. Really, all you need from that distributor is how, when you receive it, you're receiving information for the Safe Transportation Act, Sanitary Transportation Act. So your receiving protocol there is what's important from a FSMA requirement, as well as, of course, BRC compliance is going to require that you have a receiving protocol in place. But really, as far as supplier verification activities from that distributor, other than that, you really don't need anything, as long as you know who the supplier is and the location that the product was made in, and you've got documentation from them on how they comply with the preventive control, either supplier preventive control, or if it's an international foreign supplier verification program. That's the key. You got to have the documentation from them. The distributor may help you get it, but you don't really need anything specifically on the distributor. Now, that is to say, though, as part of a good verification activity, certainly if you are relying on a distribution center or a broker who takes control of the product to supply you that product, it's a good idea to keep an eye on them as well. Are they having third-party audits? Is someone in there making sure they've got cold chain in place and they have traceability in place and they have a recall program in place? They use good distribution practices as well. Definitely if they're part of your supply chain, you should keep an eye on them as well. But as far as the supplier performance paperwork, that has to come from the manufacturer.
All right, thank you very much, Gary. We have another question here for whoever would like to address it. They've asked, if the foreign supplier only supplies raw commodities like vegetables into the U.S. and processes within the U.S., does a verification program need to be set up?
Yeah, I can take a stab at it and then hand it over to John. Again, how you know if a facility has to comply with FDA basically is have they had that registered with FDA as part of the Bioterrorism Act of 2002. So commodity suppliers from outside the United States who are bringing, product is being imported into the United States, that first importer of record must ensure that that supplier meets the Foreign Supplier Verification Program. Now, raw agricultural commodities are exempt from FSMA. So it depends on what state it's in as far as product state, and it depends on exactly, is it truly bulk raw agricultural commodity, or has it been processed to a further state? So in the state meaning product state, the product state of being a raw agricultural commodity, it is exempt from FSMA. But if it's been further processed, then it would fall under the preventive control rule as far as specifically FSMA under Foreign Supplier Verification Program.
Yeah, that's bang on, Gary. From a BRC standpoint, that's where one of the variances is. We don't do that separation from a BRC. So if the importer is a BRC certified manufacturer, or if you're a BRC certified manufacturer, we expect to see that risk assessment performed. Now, raw agricultural commodities, I don't know, they're berries. Well, we know irrigation water is an issue, so we want to see how that's managed so that we don't have pathogens on it. If pesticide residue, we want to see how those things are managed. So from a BRC perspective, you want to assess, are there risks that are inherent in this product? If I'm importing, let's go to green onions or cilantro or something like that we know is an issue. We know I already know what I have to do and identify how that's being managed if it's being controlled downstream, or if it's anything else that I'm expecting the supplier to control for. So again, if I'm bringing in apples from South Africa and I expect them to be managing pesticide residue, I need to see how that's being completed. So to Gary's point on the food safety FSMA part, the easiest way to segregate that and make up your own mind on it is, be careful of going purely, well, it's a raw agricultural commodity and trying to put too much in there. Again, ask that question. Am I depending on somewhere down the supply chain managing a risk that I'm not going to oversee, in which case you need to have some form of a control in place from a BRC standpoint. So hopefully that answers.
Yeah, that's a great point, John. It's good to know where the rule kicks in, and then obviously what your scheme or customer requirements are as well. And as a QA manager, having to understand the regulatory environment versus the scheme requirement versus the customer requirements, it can get sometimes challenging because with raw agricultural commodities, FSMA says one thing, BRC says another, and we have to know the difference.
All right, thank you, John and Gary, for your answer. We are running up against time, so this will be our final question, and then our team members will follow up with other questions that have been submitted via email following the presentation. The final question will be, if the supplier controls the hazard and an audit is required, does that mean the customer has to audit the supplier themselves, or is having a GFSI audit on file adequate?
Great question. I'll chime in, and then John can certainly follow up. If it is a supplier preventive control where the supplier is controlling the hazard, and it's specifically if it's a severe hazard like a Salmonella, Listeria, E. coli, the audit must be done by what the rule requires is a qualified auditor. Now, BRC doesn't really get into the qualifications of the auditor who's performing the supplier audit. FSMA does. FSMA says it has to be a qualified auditor, which means they basically have to have audit experience and training. They don't necessarily have to be a preventive control qualified individual, although certainly that's advised and a great advantage. And I can let John speak to the adequacy of a BRC audit. Obviously, that's going to cover the vast majority of FSMA requirements. As John mentioned, there is an additional module which covers the FSMA piece, and I'll let him speak to that. But the key for FSMA compliance is that on-site audit must be done by a qualified auditor. So that can be, someone from the manufacturer going out to audit their supplier, can be a certification body, but they have to be qualified, and it can't be the supplier themselves. It has to be someone who's an agent of the manufacturer. John?
Yeah, that's bang on. I'll jump in on a couple of other things to remind you. They have a GFSI benchmarked audit. That's great. Make sure that it's up to date and valid. Remember, I said it's not common, but it's not unheard of for a certificate to be issued and sometime later that certificate to be revoked. The last thing you want to be doing is handing a certificate to an FDA inspector saying, well, this is how we have approved them, and they're well aware of the directories where they can check validity of these and find out that they are no longer, that certificate was revoked. It kind of pokes a hole in your system. GFSI approval, that's 90–95% of the way there. None of the schemes are perfect. Understand what the difference is and how those gaps are being filled. They're generally fairly straightforward and prescriptive, so they're not overly challenging. When you, especially for importers of records, what my understanding of what the FDA is going to look for from a supplier approval information pack, the name, the date that it happened on, the conclusion, including corrective actions, meaning here's the nonconformities and corrective actions, so that evidence that things were completed. As Gary mentioned, the auditor qualifications and the audit procedures, which, if it's a GFSI program, that's make sure you've got a copy of that available because to provide to them in case they have any questions. So fairly straightforward information. If your supply chain is GFSI, you're in pretty good shape. There are a few prescriptive things you want to pick up to make sure are covered.
All right, thank you. So we are coming to the end of our presentation. If you have any questions that you think of after the recording is finished, you are welcome to reach out to our wonderful presenters, John, Gary, and Sebnam. You're also welcome to visit the Eurofins Food Safety website and BRC Global Standards website displayed here for more information. We would like to thank all of our attendees and presenters for tuning in today for this broadcast. Again, a recording will be sent out to everyone who is registered, and we will work on answering everyone's questions. Thank you again, John, Gary, and Sebnam for presenting. At this time, we will conclude our broadcast. Thank you.